Jeremy's War, Chapter 13. I found Brock's quarters inside the fort and had the trunks and furniture sent there. The first thing I had to do was get his other uniform in shape. He'd been wearing the same one ever since we set sail, and it was time for a change. I unfolded the jacket, trousers, and shirt and cleaned and pressed them as best I could. I had just about finished when a corporal pounded on the door. "Private Fields!" I ran to open it. "What is it?" "General Brock says you know where his maps are. He wants them." Of course I knew where his maps were. I'd already unpacked them and put them on his desk. I gathered them up and followed the corporal through the darkened yard of the fort to a small room. Brock was there reading letters. "Ah, here they are. Everything in order, Fields?" "Yes, sir. Have you eaten, sir?" "Not yet. Maybe later. Is my other uniform ready?" Before I could answer, there was a knock, and Elliot entered, accompanied by an Indian. I had seen Indians before, but none like this. He was tall, almost as tall as Brock, and dressed in a suit of deerskin with fringes along the arms and legs. His moccasins were covered by porcupine quills. I'd heard that some sailors wore earrings. This man wore 3 rings in his nose. A large silver medal hung from his neck on a necklace of colored shells. But his face was more striking than anything he wore. His bones seemed sculpted, the smooth bronze skin covering high cheekbones, a broad chin, and a strong hooked nose. His eyes were dark and unreadable. Elliot spoke. "General Brock, this is Shawnee Chief Tecumseh." Brock rose swiftly and held out his hand. "I am honored to meet my fellow commander in our alliance against the Long Knives." This is what the Indians called the Americans, because of the hunting knives they often carried. Tecumseh gave Brock his hand. The two looked so different. Even among Englishmen, Brock was unusually fair, with his pale skin and blonde hair. Tecumseh spoke. His voice was deep and rich. He spoke no English, and Elliot translated. "I have received your request from my people not to fire their muskets. It is well advised. Muskets should be fired only at the enemy." Brock nodded. "I am glad you agree. Your Indian force, I am told, numbers 600 men." Tecumseh nodded. "Some come each day, some leave each day, like your militia." Brock smiled ruefully. "Very much like our militia, but we will need every man if we are to defeat the Americans." "Are you going to attack?" Tecumseh asked directly. "Yes, we must attack, and soon." Tecumseh nodded. "It is good to hear someone speak with a voice of action," Elliot translated. "When is your council of war?" "In an hour." Tecumseh nodded again. "I will be there." He turned to leave, then paused and turned back to Brock. "It would be good for my people if you would speak to them." "I will speak to them in the morning." "That is good." He spoke a few words to Elliot directly, then left. Elliot turned to go. "Elliot," Brock stopped him. "What did he say to you at the end that you didn't translate?" Elliot's weathered face bent into a smile. "Sir," he said, "this is a man." Most of the next hour I spent locating the officers' mess and finding some bread and cold salted pork for Brock. By the time I returned, the officers were already gathering for the meeting. Brock took the food without thinking and waved me away, then suddenly called out, "Fields!" "Sir!" "Stay near the door. I may need you to run messages." "Sir!" He gave me a dark look. "And try to make a point of not hearing things." I blushed. "Yes, sir." It was impossible, though. Everything they said inside carried through the door, especially when my ear was up against it. Brock told the officers he was considering crossing the river and attacking Detroit. He asked each officer for his opinion. One by one, they disagreed. The enemy outnumbered us. A superiority of 2 to 1 was needed to storm a fortified position. We could not count on the local militia. More American troops could be arriving at any time. Only 2 people sided with Brock. One was an old militia officer who, I learned, had known Brock for years. The other was Tecumseh. Brock listened, then began. "We must accept that we will always be outnumbered in this war, in men, in guns, in equipment, but the American general has shown us what he is made of. With superior forces, he failed to launch an assault on this fort, an assault that I am sure would have succeeded. I believe we can defeat their army. They fear us. He turned to Tecumseh. They particularly fear you and your warriors. Here is what I propose. We will issue the militia with as many redcoats as we have to spare, to make the Americans think our regular troops are more numerous. We will move the army to Sandwich across the river from Detroit. At the same time, we will construct a gun battery and move what cannon we have into position there. Meanwhile, we will dispatch a courier to Michilimackinac in the north with a letter. His real purpose is to be captured by the Americans. The letter will advise our forces there that we have 5,000 Indians with us, ready to attack, and we need no more. Of course, we have not that number in our entire army, but this general may be frightened enough to believe it. I propose to cross the Detroit River in 3 days. The Indian forces will slip across the night before and hide themselves in the bush. If our landing is opposed, they will attack from the woods. My hope is that the Americans will choose to come out of the fort and attack us in the open. If they do, I believe our trained infantry will be superior to their untrained volunteers. That is my plan, gentlemen. I count on your support and loyalty in carrying it out. There were no questions, no comments. Most of these officers had been opposed to Brock's plan since he first proposed it back in New York, but there was no point in trying to change his mind. The next morning after breakfast, Brock walked out of the fort to talk to the Indians. He met them under an oak tree just outside its walls. I watched from the gate under a warm August sun and pale blue sky. Hundreds of dark-skinned men with painted faces fanned out across the open fields. I had never seen clothing so elaborate. Rich bands of beads were draped over soft leathers decorated with more beads, feathers, and metal. Beside them, the British in their scarlet uniforms looked plain and dull. Someone told me warriors from more than a dozen tribes were gathered on that field, from the Mohawk of Upper Canada to the Creek and Osage of the American South. They had been forged into an alliance by Tecumseh, and he alone held them together. Brock spoke briefly, Eliot translating into several different tongues. The Americans were pushing the Indians farther and farther west, he told them. The British had always respected the Indians and their homelands. Now the Long Knives were threatening the homes of the British. If the children of the great king were forced from these lands, the Long Knives would take everything away and leave the Indians with nothing. Together, he finished, we shall protect both our peoples from the Long Knives. We will guarantee that your borders shall be respected, your people left free. We ask only that you help us as you have helped us before, in attacking this enemy we share. The Indians looked upon him silently, glancing occasionally at each other, sometimes nodding, sometimes shaking their heads. Then Tecumseh rose to speak. Standing there beneath the oak, his long black hair flowing down his back, he seemed to me part general, part preacher. He reminded them of past wars, of Indian villages destroyed by the American invaders, of women and children killed, of land seized by settlers and cleared of trees and wildlife. The soldiers of the great king say they are our friends. He paused. They are our friends when they need us. We do not forget that we have fought for the children of the great king against the Long Knives before, and been forgotten by the great king when the fighting was over. There was bitterness in his voice, and bitter nods of agreement met the words. But the British take little of our land. The Long Knives take much. The British ask only for skins and pelts. The Long Knives ask for everything. There is a British nation and the nation of the Long Knives. His voice floated across the field of silent listeners. We too must have a nation to protect our lands and our people. The British have promised us this nation if we will fight for them. It is the only promise we have. Let us fight for our land. A great roar rose up from the Indians in the fields. They raised their arms and shook them at the summer sky and screamed words I didn't know. Tecumseh quietly nodded to Brock. Brock nodded back. My heart pounded in my chest. These were warriors. Wild, proud, they would fight for their land as fiercely as we would. More fiercely. This was more their land than ours. Then came the betrayal. I was laying out Brock's clothes that night when I heard him speaking in the hallway outside the Proctor. I fear the Indians, worried Proctor. They're savage. In the heat of battle, they can be unimaginably cruel. Yes, Brock replied, but they are splendid fighters, and the Americans fear them. Their reputation alone is worth a regiment to me. Do you think their chief Tecumseh can control them? Yes. He's a fine leader. He has united them in this dream of some kind of Indian nation. They believe him. He was silent for a moment. Then, of course it will never happen. He could never keep them together, and I doubt we would permit it if he could. He stepped into his room, but turned to Proctor and didn't notice I was there. Let them go on believing, Proctor. We need them now more than they need us. Good night, sir. Good night. Then he saw me standing there, and saw the look on my face. Brock was lying to Tecumseh the way Uncle Will had lied to me. Deceit. That's all they knew. Deceit. Brock's pale face pinkened. What are you doing here? Laying out your uniform. Well, is it done? Yes. Then leave. I left quickly, avoiding his eyes. I stepped outside, paced across the parade ground, breathing heavily. Walking to... where? There was nowhere to go. But I wanted to go. I wanted to get away from here. I'd believed in him. He was the first man I'd ever really believed in, but he was no different. He lied when it suited him, cheated when it served his needs. There was no one you could trust. I wanted out of this army. I wanted to be away from this man.